Welcome back to ISSR's In Conversation. As always, I'm your host Anthony K Nairn, Executive Assistant of the International Society for Science and Religion, and I'm pleased to be bringing you the second part of our two-part thematic series on flourishing, here with Episode 6. This series has been putting ISSR Fellows in conversation with each other over matters related broadly to the academic field of science and religion. This episode is a little differently set up than previous ones, as it is about a jointly authored book by ISSR Fellow Professor Andrew Briggs and ISSR President Professor Michael Reiss, titled Human Flourishing, Scientific Insight, and Spiritual Wisdom in Uncertain Times, which was released in 2021 by Oxford University Press. This timely, accessible, and thoughtful book has received wide praise and invites the reader to reflect on what constitutes a good life, with data from psychology, sociology, philosophy, and more. Interviewing Professor Briggs and Professor Reiss is ISSR Fellow Philip Clayton. Together, the three of them engage deeply about the book, with Philip Clayton being an excellent interviewer. They talk about the process of creating the book and more, and I know that you will find this episode full of insights and depth. Before we get to the episode, first some details on our speakers. Professor Andrew Briggs is first holder of the chair in Nanomaterials at the University of Oxford, a post he has held since 2002. His scientific research focuses on materials and techniques for quantum technologies in which non-classical superposition and entanglement are harnessed for future applications such as quantum computers, using machine learning to run the experiments. His book with Roger Wagner, The Penultimate Curiosity, How Science Swims in the Slipstream of Ultimate Questions, has been widely reviewed internationally and formed the basis for a documentary film and a series for children. His subsequent book, It Keeps Me Seeking, The Invitation from Science, Philosophy, and Religion, written with Hans Holverson and Andrew Steen, was chosen by Times Higher Education as Book of the Week for the first issue of 2019. Michael Reiss is Professor of Science Education at the Institute of Education at University College London's Faculty of Education and Society. He's visiting professor at the Royal Veterinary College, a member of the Nuffield Council of Bioethics, and a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences. His research and consultancy interests are principally in science education, sex education, and bioethics. He's a priest in the Church of England and has worked as a psychodynamic counselor. He also has an artwork in the Museum of Modern Art. Professor Reiss has also published many hundreds of articles and over a dozen books. Professor Philip Clayton holds the Ingraham Chair at Claremont School of Theology, where he directs the PhD program in comparative theologies and philosophies. He is also affiliated faculty at the Claremont Graduate University. A graduate of Yale University, he also taught at Williams College and the California State University, as well as holding guest professorships at the University of Munich, the University of Cambridge, and Harvard University. As a scholar, Clayton works at the intersection of philosophy, theology, and science. Although he continues to work on fundamental questions that arise within each of these fields and their intersections, his more recent focus has turned increasingly to the intersection of climate science, ethics, religion, and social philosophy or eco-theology. He has published 24 books and over 350 articles. Please enjoy the final episode of ISSR's two-part In Conversation series on flourishing titled The Quest for Human Flourishing.
Well, welcome, Andrew Briggs and Michael Reiss. It's great to be able to get together and talk about your new book in this session, and I'm interested to see where it's going to go. Anyway, thanks for joining.
It's great to be with you.
Very good to be here with you, Philip.
It's a fascinating book on a topic that feels more and more urgent and important for us to discuss, especially in the context of ISSR's podcast series and the sort of scholarship and work that the members and fellows do. What drew me to Human Flourishing as I read it is we know that we're struggling in the age of technological advance, declining institutional religion, increasing global crisis. We feel these things in various tension, and you manage to bring them together within this broader focus of the question of human flourishing in what I think is a powerful way. It's interesting, you seem to state your own view on human flourishing very clearly. You organize the book carefully around central concepts, especially in parts 1 and 2, and yet at the same time, within each individual section of a chapter, these are usually only a few pages in length, you offer an alluring series of facts and insights and anecdotes that draw the reader in. You manage to keep it consistently creative and new throughout all the pages of the book. And I found that approach really works. So that's where I wanted to start with the first question. How did you happen upon this particular method of organization?
Shall I start, Andrew?
Yes, please do.
So the original idea for the whole structure of the book, so starting with 3 dimensions and then 3 pillars, and then the subsequent chapters, was Andrew's at a very early stage. And we talked about it, but it seemed to work. What we then did was quite often I was the one who'd start drafting a particular chapter, and I quite enjoy anecdotes. And then I would hand over to Andrew, who would both try and create some logical order out of these anecdotes, and then he would add on his material and pass it back to me, and we just do it iteratively like that.
And it worked very well, actually, although people sometimes ask how we managed to complete the book together and still be friends at the end of it. I'm sitting speaking to you here in the street where J.R.R. Tolkien lived in Oxford, and he and C.S. Lewis were great friends, and they worked very differently. So C.S. Lewis, would write a book, dash it off to the publisher, write the next book, dash it off to the publisher. And J.R.R. Tolkien was the opposite. Nothing was ever quite good enough and never quite ready. And I'm afraid there's a bit of a sort of J.R.R. Tolkien in me. So I was really grateful to Michael for being the C.S. Lewis to my Tolkien, so that we did actually finish the book and get it off.
I think Andrew's being rather generous, but I am happy to take comparisons with C.S. Lewis, however they come.
Did you each write the individual sections or anecdotes separately, or co-author them, or assign them to each other?
Well, we tended to write individual bits. Often it was something that we, one or other of us, felt passionate about, or we had a particular anecdote that we wanted to introduce. And then we did work very carefully together to weave them together into what we hope, created a seamless whole.
Let out your trade secret. How can the reader tell which ones anecdotes were written or sections were written by Andrew and which by Michael?
Well, of course, the anecdotes that really grab the reader are the ones I was responsible for.
Right.
I wish. Yes. I suppose if you knew one of us very well, I mean, not surprisingly, we each have particular academic specialisms, so fairly obviously stuff on machine learning. Andrew's quite often leading on things like that. But there was an enormous amount of toing and froing. And although, as Andrew says, we might have slightly different dispositions in one sense in terms of writing, reflecting subsequently, we do both have one similarity, and that is that when we want to get to the stage of submitting to the publisher, we each of us want to feel it's as good a book as it can be. So there was a lot of endless editing and re-editing, both at the general level and then quite often at the very specific level.
I'm tempted to ask you, was there a particular section that you were a primary author of that you particularly liked, particularly were proud of, thought came across well, or captured your own understanding? Maybe it's different between the two of you, your own understanding of what human flourishing is really all about.
Anything from you, Andrew?
Well, I'm just thinking about it. There's 100 different answers to that question because there's so many bits that I love. But I'll tell you something that did give me great pleasure was that the final chapter in a sense, we hadn't quite planned that at the beginning. It's the only bit we hadn't really planned at the beginning. And yet when we came to write it, we felt it inevitably arose from everything that we'd written so far. And as we say at the beginning of the chapter, you know, how can we have got this far in a book on human flourishing and scarcely said anything about love? And that was a great joy to bring that together.
Michael, was there one of those sections that when it was finished, you thought this really helps the reader get something basic about human flourishing?
I'm struggling to think of a particular section. There were bits that I was quite surprised by. I hadn't realized, for example, how convincing some of the data is about loneliness and how for some people that is frankly pretty crippling. That then linked into data on solitary confinement as a method of punishment, and that then linked to a later section when we try to explore might new technologies in robotics be any help or not? Because there are some people who just recoil from the idea that robots could help people who are lonely. And there are other people who are rather optimistic. And I will be interested to see in the next 20, 30 years what happens.
Yes, I think another bit, I mean, since you ask about what was a surprise, was when we wrote the sort of overview introduction to part 2 of the book, which is about truth, purpose, and meaning, I think it came with a fresh force, the extraordinary way in which in each of those 3, as it were, the objective reality and the subjective choice are extraordinarily intertwined in very subtle ways.
Michael, your mention of those 3 particular sections and tying them together reveals 2 things about the book that I want to send back to the 2 of you as a question. First, it shows that there are threads, often unspoken, between these individual sections, whether it's in part 1, part 2, or part 3. And that in that way, it sort of builds this message that you're talking about human flourishing. And the other one is, so that the thing about loneliness, you had stories of individuals in solitary confinement, which were staggering. I won't give it away, no spoilers here. But then you end it with a discussion of the statistics on solitary confinement in American prisons, which then move to the social dimension. You know, the lack of human flourishing has to do with a social problem and not only with individual, which is also a theme of the book, the interweaving of that personal, the social, and so forth. Does that get at it?
I think that's a lovely summary. And it's not that we, as it were, require the reader always to make those connections. We're perfectly content with a reader who reads quite a lot of some chapters, but not every word. But some people, hopefully, as you've intimated, might see that there is a bit of a spiral through the book.
Nice. Speaking of spiraling through the book, why don't we move into part 1? So you give us these dimensions of human flourishing, the material, the relational, and the transcendent. Well, they do seem like the 3 major parts of human existence. So human flourishing must encompass a physical or material dimension, a relational dimension, transcendent dimension. Is that the core thought of part 1, or would you put it differently?
I think that's a fair summary. The one thing I would say is we read other people who had a different number of, they might not have used the word dimensions, but a different number of crucial components to human flourishing. And we're quite content with that. This is not meant to be some academic systematic review or a principal components analysis of different approaches.
And a good example of that is, for example, Miroslav Volf has life going well, life feeling well, and life doing well. And we find that a very helpful way of thinking about it too. And if you're into the mathematics of these things, you can sort of think of a tensor rotation of the axes from one way of segmenting it to another. Tyler Vanderveel at Harvard has his 5+1 measures of human flourishing, and we find those very helpful as well, and they're brilliant for doing the metrology of these things. So we're quite comfortable with the different ways of thinking about it. We found this one worked well for what we wanted to say. We certainly wouldn't want to separate these dimensions of human flourishing, although it's useful to distinguish them for the purpose of thinking about them.
A philosopher might say, for the two of you, these are necessary conditions for any understanding, any theory of human flourishing. But the philosopher might ask, are they sufficient? Is there one that you might have put in, that you considered and then took out? Or do you really feel that, boy, if we have these three, we really have the framework, the dimensions of human flourishing?
The words are used by us fairly loosely: materiality, relationality, and transcendence. So one could probably get most things into those. For me, almost the more interesting question is not the sufficiency, but the necessity, because I'm comfortable with the idea that all three are pretty important, but there might be people who didn't consider relationships quite so important. And there are certainly people who are a bit dubious about transcendence as being an essential component to human flourishing.
Andrew, what would be possibilities for a view of human nature? What kind of person might choose to emphasize two and leave out the third? That would be an interesting follow-up to Michael's comment.
Well, I recognize that. I think sometimes people might assert that, but find it quite difficult to live with it, actually. In fact, I've got 1 or 2 neighbors here in Oxford who were a bit like that. but you know, do you really find someone who, however much of a materialist they claim they are, isn't moved by a sunset or by a fabulous piece of music, which might be, you know, according to their own tastes, or a poem, or a piece of art, or a play?
Now, I'm comfortable. Can I say I'm comfortable with Andrew's argument, of course, because it's one we constructed jointly. But one could imagine somebody saying, whoa, 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 hang on a sec, Andrew and Michael, I might enjoy a good symphony or reading a poem, but you've gone way beyond mere enjoyment. You're talking about transcendence, and I'm not really convinced by that. Now, of course, we hope that having read our chapter on transcendence, the person might see, oh, I see, there are degrees of transcendence, or there are different manifestations, and these two are not coming up with some cheap argument for the existence of God, just because once or twice in my life, I really felt, wow, you know, this is extraordinary, whether it's a particular friendship or a particular time out in nature or a particular piece of music.
I think for some people it's stronger than others. I think, you know, for some people, you know, the more you study this world, the more you study it as a scientist, I would say, actually. Certainly for me, and I think for many of my friends and colleagues, the more one finds it, you know, calling one to something beyond itself.
Let me ask you one last question before we move on. Knowing the two authors, one might say it can't just be a coincidence that these three focus areas are there. Basically, they might seem to include the natural sciences, in which you, Andrew, have spent your life, the social sciences, which are currently the major focus of your work, Michael, and theology, the thing that ties you both together as Christians. Is there something in that choice of 3 dimensions that reflects your complementary areas of specialization as scholars and something that unites you as persons of faith?
Yes, I think so. I think there is. It sort of relates to the first chapter in part 2, you know, that part of the subjective aspect of truth is where you choose to look and what tools you choose to seek to elucidate truth with. But I would also want to say this, you know, that to say that, well, you only say that 2 and 2 equals 4, you only say that because you're a mathematician, is not really, it's not really a very valid argument against arithmetic. And so we'd invite people to look at what we say on its merits and evaluate it on the basis of the evidence.
And the two comments I'd make is we may come back to some of these issues when we talk about part 2 of the book, particularly this issue about truth and relativism. But I rather like your actual question, you know, had there been a different pairing of authors, would they have come up with the same 3 dimensions? And I suppose, be honest, I'd have to say I don't know. It's going to be quite expensive for Oxford University Press to run a large scale trial, seeing what happens. But they could, they are a charity technically. It's a very good point. I think obviously there's always something of Andrew and me in what one writes, but equally, rather as Andrew was intimating, we're trying to connect it to a literature. You know, we're both academics, we did read rather a lot. And we're trying to produce 3 dimensions that are not just going to be rejected by people out of hand, but not rejected because they validly can think, well, they've left out X. That would be silly.
I suppose the other point there, Michael, is that we did, in preparation for the book, conduct a series of structured interviews, actually, with people who we list at the start of the book, to whom we're very grateful. And they do, between them, cover quite a wide range, and actually a rather comprehensive range of disciplines. So we really did get input from them, both in terms of insights and in terms of questions that it's important to address.
That's a good point. And the last thing I'd say is we also, as you and I know very well, had a rather small group of 3 wonderful colleagues who are also acknowledged, who tore apart virtually every first draft we came up with. That doesn't mean we got it right, but at least it got through them, as it were.
Thank you, Andrew. Let's move on to part 2 of the book, where you focus on truth, purpose, and meaning as the pillars of human flourishing. Did you consider possible other pillars to add in this area, Michael?
Yes, in a sense, I don't see these 3 as being quite as definitely the 3 one would have to have as materiality, relationships, and transcendence. I think you can fiddle around with materiality, relation, and transcendence, but I suspect you'll come close to them. These, I think, are more Andrew and me trying to make sense and thinking, look, behind our dimensions, what are they standing on? And then you try and come up with something that makes sense. And to be honest, you know, the logic of 3 and 3 makes a convenient structure for a reader.
Well, we were trying to figure out whether it was hidden vestige of the Trinity or deep Hegelian influence on, you know, but it is flows really nicely for the reader. Actually, this is the area where I want to probe a little bit. Parts 1 and 2 set the foundation for the really risky part of the book. Part 3, where you take on very present and complex issues and sort of walk us through them in order to understand something about human flourishing. But I can't rush on to 3 without just probing a little bit. What you do in the book is you say that both of these have a dimension beyond ourselves. I didn't say ultimate or objective, but some dimension beyond ourselves, and also some dimension that the individual human brings to that truth, purpose, or meaning. Is that accurate, Andrew? Is that the focus?
I think you've summarized it brilliantly, actually. Each of them seems to have what I would call an element of objective reality about them. But each of them also seems to depend in some way on our response or our choices or things that are up to us. And that comes as quite a surprise to some of my friends when I say, you know, truth is up to us. They say, well, you know, surely you're not a postmodernist, are you? And of course, as a scientist, you believe passionately that your science is seeking to describe some objective reality, and its success must be measured by the effectiveness with which it achieves that description. Nevertheless, you know, there are lots and lots of respects in which we get to choose. We get to choose what questions are we going to ask. We get to choose what instruments are we going to use with which to address those questions. And of course, what's true in life generally achieves exquisite mathematical precision when you apply it to the quantum sciences, which I do in my laboratory.
Michael, it seems like in this part, you walk a fine line between permanence and relativism on each one, defending a sort of golden mean between the two. Was that your intent?
Yes, I think that's very fairly put. So we start, as you know, quite early on in the chapter on truth. We write quite a bit about mathematics, with which both of us are comfortable. It's still part of Andrew's present work. In my past, it was mine. Because many people who are not mathematicians just sort of naively think, well, it must be truthful. And there's a lot of truth in that, but of course, without going to a whole lecture now, that's a slight oversimplification. And then we go through the various other forms of truth. So I like your point about walking a fine line. And then it was Andrew who pushed me to think about, but isn't that true of human life in general?
Nice.
That we always have these possibilities open to us. And then I think I probably then was the one who initially drew on classic existentialism as a framework without, this is not an academic book, so we don't go into the academic accounts of this, but we drew on the writings of certain famous existentialists who are particularly good, as you will know, about making clear those what we could call eternal choices that we make moment by moment when there are times of significance.
A skeptical objection occurred to me in reading part 2. I want to see what the two of you would do it. And it is, it's a concern that rather than finding the golden mean, you might have opened Pandora's box and let out a sort of relativism that will be hard to contain. So for example, truth exists, perhaps, but we have only verisimilitude, as Karl Popper said, things that are truth-like, but not truth actually in any case. Purposes exist in human consciousness, but for standard biology, not in nature, and for neo-Darwinian biology anyway. And meaning is also a subjective construct, not an objective one, despite a few examples that you try out to the contrary. How would you deal with that concern?
I think I appreciate you articulating it, and I think I'd say it's a risk worth taking. And the reason it's a risk worth taking is I don't think it helps to give easy answers to hard questions. And I think if you've got hard questions, it's better to think hard about them, to recognize the difficulties, to recognize the aspects that are still open questions. I think that does more good than giving a superficial answer which isn't going to last when you really face the storms.
I like that. And I would add that, of course, although the story of Pandora exists in various versions, perhaps the best known one is where truth, where the best known version is where hope is also released at the end. It's one of the things in her box, as well as all the problems. So the alternative to admitting these problems, and as you say, the degree of subjectivity and therefore personal bias, is to insist on absolutes. And we live now, I'm increasingly conscious at a time where people who insist on absolutes are often of more worry to the rest of us than the relativists are, because relativists, when pushed, suddenly tend to be rather good at feeling things like their family are important, that somebody else lying is important. People who just believe in absolutes are harder to shift.
Nicely put. Let's move on to part 3. It's the longest, in some ways, most substantial part of the book, and the one that draws the readers in the most, I think. Parts 1 and 2 lay a foundation for it, but here's where you take risks. You even worry out loud whether what you write here will be left behind by history too quickly. Did it worry you at all to choose human science and religion and technology when each one is so fluid and changing so quickly?
Well, and no, on the contrary, we chose them because they're changing so quickly. We deliberately wanted to identify issues that are coming up where the changes are so rapid that, you know, the conventional, people have been thinking about human flourishing probably since before writing was invented. And so there's been a lot of thought that's gone into it, and we recognize that. And so we rather deliberately wanted to choose as our sort of, as it were, case studies, areas where either the conventional wisdom has to be applied afresh or new thinking needs to be developed.
Isn't there something paradoxical in getting to human flourishing as an enduring concept through highly transient issues arising in these fields? Or is there something necessary or deeply right about that?
I like the academic point you're making, but of course, if I just think of something like gene technologies, which we write a bit about, the answer to your question is no, because the hope from the people working to develop gene technologies is, roughly speaking, that they're going to enable or promote human flourishing. The hesitations or cautions that some people have, again, are rooted in the fact that ultimately they won't be good for human flourishing. So rather usefully, there's a sort of tacit agreement that human well-being stroke flourishing is what we want to promote, as well as a sustainable earth. And it's then when you get into the detail of things like machine learning, where Andrew took the lead, or the gene technologies where we both wrote equally, that you begin to hopefully see, well, might it or might it not contribute to human flourishing?
And if you're going to address that properly, you need to sharpen up your thinking about what human flourishing consists of, which is why you need the first bits of the book. So just you know, take the human genome. Let us suppose that in the years to come, I can offer you gene editing for a few tens of thousands of dollars that will make your offspring more likely to get into an elite university. Would you pay tens of thousands of dollars for that? You bet you would. But are you actually going to promote their flourishing thereby? Is that what flourishing really consists of? So that was why we need what's gone before in the book, and that's why we wanted to tackle hard areas like that.
Mm-hmm. Actually, that's a brilliant way of sort of summarizing the way that the details in this third part and the overarching theme intersect. Actually, that's a sentence that captures the method of writing, the method of thinking that you offer us throughout the book as a whole. I have only one question about the first of the 3 sections in part 3, which is limits to predictability. And then I want to really go deep with you on the latter 2 before we run out of time. In limits to predictability, the theme I walked away with most strongly was the sense that given unpredictability, given complex systems, we need to view human beings as free. And the freedom assertion seemed very fundamental to this section. And I saw you both nod there. Having written a couple of books on freedom, I recognize it as the most difficult philosophical problem I've ever worked on. And how does one actually get from unpredictability of a biological system, say, to the assertion of freedom as an actual reality in the world?
So I would answer, we decided we wouldn't try and answer that question in the book. There were 2 big areas we decided we wouldn't try and cover. One of them, a bit separate from the point you're raising, was human consciousness, but the other one was free will. So we could, of course, tried, you know, would have been another 10-ish pages. We didn't feel we had something substantively new to add, particularly given our focus on human flourishing. So there's, as it were, a little bit of an ontological gap between the unpredictability and, as you say, then the human freedom.
Well said. I like the honesty of that answer.
I can just add a tiny bit from some work that I've been doing since the book was finished, which is on the role of randomness in learning. So we're actually putting some mathematical precision into the thermodynamics of a learning machine, and we're running the experiment in the lab as we talk, and we're doing the theory in parallel. The amazing thing is that you need randomness for learning to happen in a way that we can now give mathematical precision to. So unlike Danny Kernebon's book last year, which sort of says that noise is a terrible thing, whatever happens, and you have to try to minimize it, if you're going to learn, and we can't be humans without learning, I don't think, you need this stochastic process in a way that you can mathematically give content to in order for learning to happen. I'm finding that a very exciting discovery journey myself at the moment.
Now, this is me, Philip, this is me getting off message because I didn't know Andrew was doing that. And that sounds beautiful, because if I think of classroom learning, because as you both know, my background as a schoolroom teacher, it makes complete sense, because the good teacher at times minimizes the noise. You know, you're trying to introduce, let's say, Newton's laws. You do it in an artificial lab situation, very simply in school physics, but you then always have to broaden out to the real world. And it's that sort of mixture of the two. So, Andrew, I look forward to hearing more about that, because that sounds really good.
Lovely. Let's move on to chapter 9, Religion and Human Flourishing, which some will find especially interesting. So many people bemoan the demise of institutional religion. And yet you seem to view the increasing focus on spirituality, which at least in Europe and North America, as a positive development. There isn't much hand-wringing about, you know, the numbers in institutional religion are failing. Did I read you right on that?
Do you want to start, Andrew, or do you want me to?
Off you go, Michael.
Yeah. So it's rather jokingly going back to your point about Hegel. You know, people who love Hegel would like more references to Hegel. So both of us are completely conventional Christians, church tenders. It would be wonderful to have more people regularly worshipping, praying, where their Christian beliefs infuse their lives and so forth. Fortunately, neither Andrew nor I are responsible worldwide for the numbers attending Christian worship. So part of me genuinely sees this, I'm not going to start lecturing to you about Hegel, but, you know, spirit of the time, these things are what they are, sort of thing. And we certainly don't belong, at least I'll speak for myself, I don't belong to the people who think that it's the numbers that are what most matter. There's this very interesting intersection between religious belief, religious experience, and religious practice, and then the formalization of those. On the bigger point about religion, I think historically it's so difficult to predict what will happen. I'll only say one more thing. I was rather surprised in some of the reading that I did for this chapter to find that the most robust sociological estimates suggest that worldwide, the percentage of people for whom religion is important is slowly increasing. It's already about 85%. The predictions are it'll drift upwards only a few percentage points. You haven't got much more to go when you start at 85, the next 20 years or so. I don't know how long I will live. I shall be very interested to see if there are changes. And one final anecdote, when I was a young man, I would have found it inconceivable in my own country, the UK, at how few people now between the ages of 16 and 24 regularly drink alcohol to excess. In my time, that was so common among young men and becoming rapidly more common among young women. Things do change remarkably quickly. Who am I to know how the numbers attending, you know, mosques, synagogues, churches, etc., will change?
Well, I love the parallel between decreasing drunkenness and increasing institutional religion. Let me move on to chapter 10, because we really need to spend time on your conclusion, actionable love. And this is human flourishing in an age of technology. And both of you, but Andrew was the lead here. I was fascinated by your choice of machine learning as one of the two tech topics that you focused in most deeply. I mean, there's lots that push the panic buttons in humans, but most non-specialists don't view machine learning as a threat, as significant as you do. So can you say, sort of for the record, Andrew, why this seemed crucial to include as one of your central topics?
First of all, I'm a passionate advocate for machine learning. We develop it in my lab. It's already accelerating the development of quantum technologies, which I work on. Probably the greatest benefits are being seen in healthcare, where it's really accelerating both the development of and application of drugs and selection of drugs, and radiology is just being transformed by machine learning. If people think they're not subject to machine learning, then they just don't know what they're doing. Because every time they Google, every time they use Facebook, the machine learning is crawling all over them, harvesting their data exhaust. And the damage that it's doing is becoming increasingly well documented. So a lot of people point to a sort of upturn in the hockey stick. Around about 2012 seems to be about the turning point of teenage and young person mental health problems, expressed in things like anxiety and so on, in worst cases, suicides, worse for girls than for boys, often to do with things like body image and so on. And this is all being powered by industrialized influence through machine learning. So if people that think they're not being, they are. And we've really got to work out, and I don't know any way to do it other than to say, what does it mean for humans to flourish? And how would we then apply that so that we get the benefits of machine learning, which I would define in terms of promoting human flourishing, and somehow through a mixture of education and regulation and whatever else, we constrain the harmful effects.
So I come at my next question from a very popular Netflix documentary called The Social Dilemma.
It's a brilliant
I was involved in some ways. And the question is this: is it machine learning as such that's the difficulty, or the capitalization of machine learning, the use of it by Facebook or any other person who counts clicks as forms of profit? The longer they can hold us on the social media, the more we're involved with our hormonal system, right, with affect, the more likely we are to keep clicking, and therefore the more ads we see and the more money they make. Is it machine learning as such, or is it the confluence of machine learning and a sort of, may I say, vicious capitalism off of teenagers and other users?
I think you're really answering your own question, aren't you? It's the second of those. Ros Picard at MIT Media Lab interacts with quite a lot of very senior people in the big data companies. And she finds that there are people there who do care about these people of high ethical standards, who time and again are trumped by the increase in shareholder value, which drives the company, and in many cases, the incentivization packages of the senior leadership teams.
Michael, as a social scientist, do you see a connection between this phenomenon that Andrew was just describing and the freedom comments you made with regard to chapter 8 a few minutes ago? Is it something about our freedom that we're losing, and the human flourishing element is tied in with that somehow?
I think that's a very good point. I'm not an academic political theorist, but I would say we're in the early stages of using machine learning, and many new technologies, when first introduced, tend to be introduced with wild enthusiasm. They then go through a number of chaotic ups and downs, both in terms of influence and how people react to them, and then they steady down, and humanity is often quite good at extracting good from them. So I am a natural optimist And I don't want to lose what Andrew referred to, some of the existing benefits in, for example, healthcare that are clearly coming from machine learning. And I suspect that's because we're focused there not so much on a narrow neoliberal return of profit, but the goals are equally explicit, but their goals more to do with straightforwardly prolongation of health.
Mm-hmm. By contrast, your second topic in the Age of Technology chapter does sound scary, even to the non-specialist. You write, quote, gene synthesis will take all this further to the point where it will one day be possible to type in the complete genome of an organism and synthesize the gene with sufficient fault-tolerant error correction to render the genome useful for information storage and synthetic biology. Both of you are so pro-science, but is this a point where what we want to say to the science is put the brakes on? Or what should we walk away from this section thinking? And
I don't want to say. I'm on the board of a company that is developing this technology, and I was there last Tuesday, and the progress is astonishing, absolutely astonishing. A long way from being able to type in a whole human genome. Obviously, that's long way ahead. But the ingredients really are making great progress, and they've got great potential benefits. Okay, supposing that cancers have a genetic basis, which they do, and supposing you could do genetically what you already do with vaccination to inhibit the probability of suffering from a disease, wouldn't you want to do that if you could? I would. The trouble is, and this is where, although the details are so different, the deeper you dig, the more the issues converge. Rather like machine learning, you have to say, what does it mean for humans to flourish? What are our criteria for how we're going to use this? And, you know, how do we get people to buy into those criteria for themselves?
mm-hmm. Can I ask the two of you to answer a question you pose rhetorically a few pages later, page 207 in the Kindle version? Here's your question. If we know, this picks exactly up on what Andrew just said, if we know that there are genetic contributions to cancer, heart disease, mental illness, and sexual preference, and if one day we learn the causal links, then how should prospective parents and physicians decide on responsible genetic intervention? How would you answer that question?
So my answer would be, roughly speaking, with this criterion of human flourishing informed by quite a lot of freedom of choice for parents. So I'd like to see a world where, in terms of sexual orientation of children, more and more countries don't feel that's something as parents that they want to be able to determine for their children. And anyway, it's rather likely that the genetic component will be fairly small. Whereas for things like very classically avoidance of certain diseases, people, I think, will increasingly just think it's a no-brainer. One of the interesting things, because I've been writing about genetic engineering for decades, was that people genuinely thought 30 years ago it wouldn't be long till we saw gene therapies for humans. They've taken a long time to come, but they are now genuinely coming in the sense of they are being used not just in clinical trials, but in reality. And I think they will lead to widespread acceptance. That may not be the case in agriculture. You know, it'll be very interesting to see in 10 or 20 years' time whether what some people regard as some of the hype for these new technologies for agriculture, like medicine, actually does come to pass or does not.
Let's close this ISSR podcast with your conclusion, the fourth and final part. You call this closing part actionable love. In the text, you offer some lovely definitions and descriptions of altruism with data that I actually found, and charts, and even one large equation, which I found fascinating. Let's just jump right to the very conclusion. You close the book with a concluding section on love as the essence of flourishing. And interestingly, the topic you cover there is climate change. You mentioned two reasons for ending your book on human flourishing with climate change. And I'd like to ask you about each one. The first one is the great impact, the incredibly large impact of climate change on the possibility of human flourishing in the age. Could one of you talk about that? It seems, I read the whole book backwards from that point when I got to it and thought that must be really fundamental to what these guys are doing.
So to go first, as somebody whose background was in mainstream ecology and who's therefore been writing about biodiversity loss and global climate change for a rather long time, things are not looking good, as I suspect everybody listening to this podcast will know. The only good thing is that the number of people and organizations and companies that accept that things are not looking good is increasing as a proportion, and more organizations and countries are realizing, even if you're only interested in narrow economic returns, there are arguments for either ameliorating or otherwise dealing with climate change. I've little doubt that, assuming humans are still around in a couple of hundred years' time, people look back on the period from roughly 1970s to whatever it is, 2030, with just absolute near despair. I mentioned loss of biodiversity because climate change you can ultimately probably address. Loss of biodiversity, including extinction rates, are, to all intents and purposes, irredeemable, and I deliberately use a theological term.
Mm-hmm. So as the head of an organization, ecociv.org, I spend my time with the climate data and various people's responses to try to increase human action and resolve in the face of what some pretty frightening data that the scientists are telling us and model scenarios that are predicted. The two of you place this moral dilemma, if I may, in the context of human flourishing, actually the intersection of that and love as the essence of flourishing. It's a hypothesis about how to help humans to make better decisions. Can you flesh out that hypothesis so it's clear to every listener that that's where your book goes?
Just that's illustrated by why we chose, or one of the reasons for choosing this topic, in addition to what Michael's just said, in full alignment with it, that if you take the core Judeo-Christian instructions about love, they are to love God and love your neighbor. And we were trying to think, what's a way of talking about loving God that people who don't come from that tradition could nevertheless understand? And a lot of the talk about global climate change is because of the anthropocentric threats and the anthropocentric benefits. But could there be a sort of deeper motivation for caring about the climate? And if you think of the creation as just that, as God's creation, then you can think about caring for it in terms of love for God, which you can make completely consistent with love for neighbor. And so we felt that that gave us a way of bringing those two injunctions together. And of course, they come together beautifully in the quote from Sir John Houghton as well.
Yes, I did want to close with that one, but first I wanted to say, it's funny because as you developed your answer, I thought you would say you would go to love of God and love of neighbor, and then the question, who is my neighbor in the New Testament? And the neighbor turns out to be much broader than people had thought. So for many of the religious traditions of the world, where that would take them is to say neighbors are not only humans, but all living things, Gaia, all members of all ecosystems, all with whom we are interdependent, pratitya samutpada in the Buddhist tradition. I didn't see that theme in the book, but some people would see the book as 1 millimeter short of taking that step.
So again, for me, I would answer that I'm absolutely delighted for the reader who makes that jump themselves. It's merely, we're trying to cover human flourishing. It's difficult to decide where to draw the boundaries. It's like your earlier very good question about we don't really cover free will. I would be extremely comfortable with those extensions. But there comes a point when writing a book for the general reader, you either think, well, we're going to tokenistically put in one section of a chapter, or we're going to add another huge chapter. And we decided to limit ourselves. But I would be very pleased, even for the reader who doesn't quite know what comes next, who ends up thinking, yeah, but, you know, is it just humans?
It's interesting that this is the one place in a title where you wrote love as the essence of flourishing and didn't include the adjective human. And Andrew, you mentioned Sir John Houghton, one of Britain's most distinguished climate scientists, and what he said: although my science and my faith always sat quite comfortably together, it wasn't until I started working more specifically on climate change that they began to interweave. It feels like perhaps for you as authors also, this synthesis of science and spirituality is most clearly seen in the climate change problem. Do I read you correctly on that, Andrew?
I would be quite comfortable with that. I don't think it was in my mind when I wrote it. And, you know, they come together in my lab when I'm working on quantum nanoscience. They come together, which happens to be my scientific speciality, you know. So I like to see them there as well. So I would echo for my science what John Houghton found for his climate science.
Lovely, lovely. I'd like to close with a question. It's a book that seeks to be hopeful, and you really, as Michael said about his disposition a few minutes ago, you don't incline toward despair. You don't focus on the darkest scenarios, but on the possibility of our moving things forward. You presuppose freedom. You focus on purpose and meaning. You continually remind us of the importance of a focus beyond ourselves on something transcendent. And so I think I just want to close by asking Andrew and then Michael, for you as an author of this profound and important book, ultimately, what gives you hope?
Hope is at the heart of human flourishing, so it's a wonderful closing question. As a Christian, ultimately, my hope is in Jesus Christ. And in that context, there are lots of signs that give me hope. The resilience of the created world, the fact that people are now realizing that we have to be more careful about it, the wonderful creativity and resourcefulness of the human mind, the next generation that's coming along of wonderful people, creative people, people with fine values. And I think increasingly there is talk about human flourishing. There are human flourishing activities, courses, research at leading US universities. A leading philanthropy has a major program on human flourishing. And as people think more about what is it really for a human to flourish? What are humans for? Why are we here? So I hope that that will inspire them to think about the underpinning values, which in turn will indeed promote human flourishing.
Michael, thank you. Michael, what gives you hope?
So hope is traditionally thought of as one of the three theological virtues, and that for someone with a religious faith as myself is useful because it suggests to some extent it's a gift. It's not that each of us has to, as it were, within ourselves manufacture hope. It is available to all of us to draw on. Broadening beyond humans, I have a certain hope in the natural world. There's a degree of resilience there. It's not able infinitely to cope with human stupidity and inappropriate exploitation, but it can, as it were, counteract some of that. We have some time, that gives me hope, but I don't want to equate hope with a conviction that all will be well in the narrow sense of the term. I think there's an enormous amount of human action needed. And one of the things I learned from writing the book with Andrew was an awful lot of specifics where humans can do a lot to enable flourishing. And we do need individually, collectively, societally, and worldwide to do rather a lot in quite a short space of time.
Andrew, Michael, thank you so much for joining the ISSR podcast. It's been a brilliant and fascinating discussion, and I look forward to seeing your next co-author.
Thank you.
Best wishes to
Thank
you
you
both.
very
Bye
much,
now.
Philip. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you for listening to this episode of ISSR's In Conversation. ISSR is an elite academic society with over 350 fellows around the globe. We began the In Conversation series in 2022 with the hope of sharing academic talks on the academic field of science and religion with the public widely. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to our channel. You may also leave us a comment and/or suggestion for future episodes. Also, all relevant links related to this talk will be in the description box below. Before I conclude, the next 2 episodes are already in editing, so I'm happy to share a little glimpse at what will be to come. The next episode will be on the late John Polkinghorne, the founding president of ISSR, who died on 09 March 2021. The discussion was an excellent one with many contributors, and I'm looking forward to getting that out to you in the next few weeks, so watch out for that. The episode following will be a discussion with the 3 winners of the 2022 ISSR Book Prize on Science and Religion, and they're in discussion with members of the judging committee. I think this will appeal to anyone engaged with the field or interested in academic writing generally. For more information about ISSR or to check the latest happenings in the field of science and religion, please check our website issr.org.uk in the box below, and we'll see you next time on In Conversation.